Baseball is officially back as pitchers and catchers report to Port St. Lucie today. On the show, I'm going to break down which Mets arms have the most to prove this spring training.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Well, today is the day for P's and C's to report. Pitchers and catchers all showing up to Port St. Lucie, which means the 2025 season is officially upon us. We got about, 6 or 7 weeks of spring training before you get to that first game of the season. It's going to be a lot of fun to see how this team progresses over this period of time, which is why today we're going to talk about which Mets pitchers have the most to prove this time of year, because you have some arms like a Sean Manaea, Frankie Montas, David Peterson, starting pitchers who you know what their role is going to be. You know they're going to be in that rotation. It's just about getting themselves stretched out. There's really not a lot of debate as to whether they should be available or whether they should have a roster spot. In the bullpen, you can say the same thing. Edwin Diaz, he's going to be your closer. Ryan Stanek is going to be one of the guys setting him up. AJ Minter has to prove health a little bit because he's coming off a hip surgery, but the expectation is he'll be ready to go either on opening day or shortly thereafter that, and we're not really concerned with what the Grapefruit League stats are going to be for AJ Minter if and when he gets on the hill. But there's other guys to talk about. We're going to start this thing off with the guy who I think got the most dialogue spoke about them today, from meeting with the media himself with his interpreter, and Carlos Mendoza fielding more questions about this pitcher than anyone else. That's Kodai Senga. Kodai Senga is the big question mark with the Mets rotation. Sure, there's a competition for that sixth starter role that we'll be talking about in the next segment. But the guy that can move the needle the most for the Mets this year is Kodai Senga. We saw in 2023, he has the ability to be one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball. 2024, he only made it on the mound for one regular season start through 5 brilliant innings. Then he induced a pop-up in the 6th inning that effectively ended his season. He made a heroic return in the NLDS against the Phillies, gave up a leadoff homer to Kyle Schwarber, but got through 2 innings. And then when we saw him again in the NLCS, it was just not pretty. What we've learned at this point is that Kodai Senga is on track to be ready for opening day, whether he gets that nod to start on opening day or not. The expectation at this point is he should be healthy and ready to go. But there's still a massive question mark here, because last year he showed up to camp healthy. We thought he was going to be the opening day starter, and then he wasn't bouncing back right. That turned into a shoulder injury, which kept him out until the middle of July, or actually really the end of July, right before the trade deadline. Gets back on the mound after fully rehabbing that shoulder, and then on that pop-up, he has the calf strain, which again pretty much ended his season. Carlos Mendoza said today that after the playoffs, Senga still had to basically finish his rehab for that calf, which shows you, what it took for him to get back on the mound and give anything to the Mets in the playoffs, which really was an effort that fans are not going to appreciate because the results weren't there. But that does show you his commitment to the team. He had to, after that, still sort of build himself back up for a healthy offseason, where it really wasn't until January where he was good to go and sort of shutting down before eventually ramping back up. And now, again, the expectation is he should be ready for opening day. But he has more to prove than almost any starting pitcher in camp, because you really don't know what you're going to get from Kodai Senga. Is he going to be a healthy pitcher? We're going to be holding our breath every time he takes the ball, particularly once he starts to build up in these games, to see how he bounces back. If all goes well, he should be right atop your rotation. But throughout the season, that is going to be a story to monitor, because the New York Mets, if they don't have Kodai Senga, they're probably going to have to push the chips in at the deadline to get a real ace to come in here and to help Sean Manaea at the front of that rotation, when you hopefully are vying for a playoff spot and then into October. So Kodai Senga right now is a Mets pitcher that has a ton to prove. It's almost exclusively health, but even the fact that we saw him pitch in the playoffs and he didn't have a ton of success, that's going to lead some people to overreact if he has some bad results in the Grapefruit League. Personally, I just want this guy healthy, not feeling pain after his starts, building up to a normal workload, and then you see what you get in season. But he is definitely a guy that has a lot to prove. And then as we go out through the rest of the rotation, again, Manaea, Montas, Peterson, I'm not really too concerned about what they look like throughout the spring training season. But once we get into the season, those guys will have a lot to prove. The guy that does have something to prove right here, right now, is Clay Holmes, because he has not been a starting pitcher since his time with the Pirates. And he had many years as one of the top relief pitchers in baseball. This is a guy that has the profile of someone that could make that transition that we've seen so many other arms over the last couple of years, convert and go from being a top-end reliever to a really good starter. Last year, you saw Ronaldo Lopez and Garrett Crochet as the two most notable names. Seth Lugo, of course, has been doing it over the last couple of seasons, first in San Diego last year, Cy Young runner-up in Kansas City. You've seen Jordan Hicks take a stab at it, and there's some others I'm sure I'm failing to mention right now. Clay Holmes has a lot to prove because he's got to show that his stuff can hold up across multiple innings. Now, at the beginning of his spring training, of course, it's going to be 1 to 2 inning stints, not too dissimilar to what we saw when he was with the Yankees. But as camp progresses, he's going to have to start turning a lineup over potentially. And then getting into the season, of course, he's going to have a ton to prove. But what does he look like as a starting pitcher? We know this is a guy with an exceptional sinker. That's why he has one of the best ground ball rates in baseball. Really good sweeper, slider, those breaking pitches that work so well off of the sinker to get a bunch of strikeouts as a reliever. But there was not a real fourth pitch. Is he going to lean into a four-seam fastball up in the zone so he can change eye levels? That's a possibility for Clay Holmes. Does he have a changeup that he can go to as a weapon to throw against left-handed hitters? These are things that he's going to be tinkering with throughout spring training, and it's going to be a really interesting story to follow. How does he make that progression? What I will say is this guy is doing everything he can to make this a successful move into the rotation. He showed up about a month early in the middle of January. He was in Port St. Lucie. He's been working closely with all of the Mets support staff when it comes to their pitching development. And we'll see what happens here for Clay Holmes. He is another real wild card. I think Kodai Senga really has the ability to change the ceiling of this rotation. And Clay Holmes, you can say that as well, but he also has a chance to really build out the floor of this rotation, because if you have Clay Holmes as a really good, viable starting pitcher, if Frankie Montas can be a little bit better than he was last year, if Manaea can repeat the success he had, and if David Peterson can as well, well, now even putting Kodai Senga aside, you have 4 starting pitchers as the foundation of a rotation going into the year. So those are the 2 guys in the rotation that had the most approved this spring. We're going to talk about the guys that are competing for the final spot in a 6-man rotation in just a minute. First, though, a quick word from our sponsors. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios are one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feel fuller longer. Personally, I love the no shells variety, and my personal favorite right here, the honey roasted. Absolutely delicious. I mean, when I'm working here late at night recording Locked On Mets, right on my desk, if I'm feeling a little bit hungry, but I don't want to have one of those late night snacks that's going to kill me the next day as far as my diet, couple of Wonderful Pistachios. I'm no longer feeling those hunger pangs, and they're so good. Sometimes it's hard to put these things down. Wonderful Pistachios, no shells. Just make it easy to grab and go wherever you want a snack, whether you're on the golf course, going on a road trip. They are the place to get that complete protein, providing all 9 essential amino acids. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Get snackin and get crackin with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 13,000 subscribers. Appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. And one of the things that Carlos Mendoza confirmed today is the New York Mets are planning to roll with a six-man rotation, assuming Kodai Senga is healthy. And that would not even be a six-man rotation that would be affected by off days necessarily. So if the Mets had an off day and they could get Senga that extra rest day while keeping just a five-man rotation, at this point, it does not seem like they're inclined to sort of mix and match with that and really just focus on Senga getting that extra rest. Instead, it would be, hey, if there's a day off in the schedule and instead of 5 days rest, Senga gets 6 days rest or 7-day rest, that's great. And I think the whole point of that is you're looking at hopefully a team that can make a deep playoff run, and you want Senga ready for that marathon. You want Sean Manaea, who broke down at the end of last year in that final game where he just didn't have anything left in the tank. You want him to have a little bit more to pitch deep into October. If Brandon Sproat factors into this rotation at any point this season, your top pitching prospect, he too would be on not necessarily an innings limit, because the Mets have said they don't really set innings limits on their pitchers, but he's still a guy you would monitor. Clay Holmes, he's going to have a massive spike in innings if he can stay in this rotation. So you want to monitor that. Even a David Peterson, who, had a great season last year, his season didn't start until the end of May. So he's got to make it through a full go around. Frankie Montas, still only a couple years removed from a shoulder injury. So all of this is to say that the Mets are probably going to stick with that six-man rotation for a majority of this season, unless it gets to the point like last year where it just proves to be more beneficial to stick with 5 guys that you really trust. So in camp here, there is a 6-starter role that's open. Now, one of the names that we thought could factor in has already been deemed a reliever, and that is Jose Butto. Carlos Mendoza confirmed today that Butto will pitch out of the bullpen in a bulk relief role. They're going to build him up to 45 pitches. That means in an ideal situation, he's giving you 2 innings every time out. Maybe there's some times where he gives you 7 outs or 8 outs, or hey, maybe there's an outing where he's super efficient. He gives you 3 whole innings out of the bullpen. But Jose Butto will be a relief pitcher. I think this makes a lot of sense because he thrived in that role last year, and the competition for that 6-starter role is pretty steep. You got Paul Blackburn and Griffin Canning, couple MLB veterans who have had plenty of experience in big league rotations. You have Tylor Megill that has a lot of upside still, and I think he probably has the most upside of that trio. Butto, to try to wedge himself into that mix, it was going to be tough. He does not have an option, so that means he can't be sent down to Syracuse. Feels like he is pretty locked in to be a reliever and to be a guy that's really going to help with this 6-man rotation, because you're going to have some pitchers who are flexible in a bullpen that's going to be pitching a man short all year. So I like the idea that Butto is just locked into that relief role. I think he can thrive in it just like he did last year. Hopefully he pitches a little bit better when the moment really matters the most in October, because he definitely struggled in those big, big moments. Now let's talk about the competition. If you want to talk about some arms with something to prove, it's 3 guys who are vying for 1 spot potentially in the rotation. You got Tylor Megill, you got Griffin Canning, you got Paul Blackburn. In some respects, Tylor Megill has the most to prove because he is right now slated for Syracuse. I've talked about this all off season. Megill is likely going to end up in AAA just by function of the fact that he still has an option year left. So he's the one guy out of these 3 that they can put in Syracuse without losing anybody when it comes to their depth. And we know when you're talking about getting through 6 months of baseball, or 162 plus, as Carlos Mendoza likes to say, you're going to need as many irons in the fire as possible. So we saw last year, there were some pitchers that had better springs, particularly in the bullpen, than some of the guys that actually made the roster. And that was mostly due to the guys that had that roster flexibility, that can go to Syracuse, and guys that the Mets would have lost if they did not bring them onto the team. So same thing goes here with the rotation. There's a very good chance that Tylor Megill just ends up being boxed out because you're going to roster Canning and Paul Blackburn You can't option them. You'd have to DFA them and hope that nobody claims those guys and they accept the assignment to Syracuse if you are going to try to pass them down to the minor leagues. So Megill has an uphill battle, but again, I feel like he might have the most talent of that trio. I mean, we saw a couple starts last year, one against the Dodgers in particular. I think there was another one late in the year. I can't remember if it was against the Cubs. I can't recall, but I know there was two starts where Tylor Megill was excellent, and he pitched deep into the game. It really shows you what he could be as a big league starter that now has sort of the kitchen sink of options to throw at you, but in particular, the implementation of that great American spork, his splitter, having his fastball, and that he can work up in the zone, then the implementation of a two-seam to try to get the ball on the ground a little bit. All of that could help Megill become a really good pitcher. I'm not expecting him to ever be a frontline starter, but can Tylor Megill this year have a similar ascent to what we saw from David Peterson last year? I don't think it's outside the realm of possibilities. So he's got a lot to prove in spring training, and I've talked about this notion on the show a couple times over the last few weeks. Tylor Megill is always boxed out. And somehow, since 2022, his first full MLB camp, he has found his way in the roster each year due to injuries from other guys. So I would not count him out, but he does have an uphill battle this spring. Then it comes to Canning and Blackburn, two guys that were recently acquired. Blackburn in a trade at the deadline last year. Canning signed to a deal a little over $4 million this offseason, a signing that surprised a lot of people, myself included, because he's coming off a really bad year. Griffin Canning last year had a 5.19 ERA. He gave up more runs than any other pitcher in the American League, 99. Now, part of all the runs he gave up is the fact that he was very available for the Angels. He eclipsed 170 innings pitched, which is not nothing. To have a guy coming off a healthy season that could weather the storms of another marathon and give you 30 starts potentially. I'm not sure how many starts you get to in a six-man rotation. I'd have to do the math on that one, but still, this is a guy that has a little bit of upside. Former second-round pick. He's 28 years old, so he's still relatively young. And you look at what he did in 2023, he pitched to a 4.32 ERA and 127 innings pitched. Now, last year, his fastball got nuked a ton. 16 home runs allowed on his fastball alone, 31 given up overall. But he was with an organization that didn't really have the technology the Mets do, did not have a pitching lab, and whatever analytics they did have behind the scenes, they weren't great at implementing it. Now you come to the Mets, who are becoming this team that's heralded for their ability to get more out of pitchers. He is a really interesting project because he's athletic, guy that won a Gold Glove, because he's still 28 years old, and he has one thing that not many pitchers do going into this season. He is coming off a year with 170-plus innings pitched. That is something to hold your hat on in the big leagues this day. Innings are valuable. So right now, I think Griffin Canning is the favorite, although very slight favorite. And the reason I say that is because Paul Blackburn, while I think is a very similar, I don't want to say that their stuff is similar, but very similar in standing in Major League Baseball, Paul Blackburn is to Griffin Canning, guys that are fifth starters, really at best. Blackburn, though, had that spinal fluid leak that he had to have surgery on in October. 4 to 5 month timeline for him to return has him right around now getting going. The Mets at this point have said that they think he can be ready for opening day, but that's a big question mark. So that's why I say Griffin Canning is the favorite to get that sixth starter role, because Megill is likely heading to Syracuse because he has that option, and Blackburn might not be healthy. So you add those things together, I think that we're going to be looking at Griffin Canning breaking camp with the New York Mets in the rotation, making potentially 27 starts. I just did the math, and 162 divided by 6 is 27. So we'll see exactly where that leads the New York Mets this season when it comes to their six-man rotation. But I think those are the three guys, when you're talking about the pitchers, that really have the most to prove when it comes to performance. Those guys are going to be in a tough battle to grab that final spot, and then to figure out who's going to slide into the bullpen. And that's where we're going to close the show. Do all three of those guys make the roster? Could Megill end up being an effective reliever? Who else in camp should we be watching when it comes to the arms vying for those spots in the pen? We'll talk about it all in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks from the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways. If you want to be one of our Locked On Mets insiders, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. When we look at the Mets bullpen, there's a couple of arms that we can write in pen right now to make the team. Obviously, Edwin Diaz will be your closer. Assuming AJ Minter is healthy and ready to go coming off the hip surgery, he's going to be his primary setup man. Ryan Stanek should be right there in that mix as well. Jose Butto is now pretty much locked in, secured to be a multi-inning reliever for the Mets. That right there is four guys. Count out the names in the rotation that we've been talking about throughout the show. Guys that will not be optioned unless David Peterson has just a tragic camp, which I'm not expecting. You can add up 7 more arms to your pitching staff. Manaea, Senga, Montas, Peterson, Holmes, Canning, and Blackburn. Now, we don't know which of Canning or Blackburn is going to be in the rotation, which would be a long man in the bullpen. I still think there's a world where the Mets get more creative than they're suggesting right now, where they have both of those guys in sort of flexible Swiss Army knife roles. You'll have Butto as well. If you really want to, you don't have to have a 6 starter written in pen in that depth chart. You can really go with 5, look at the off days you have. Sometimes stick with the 5-man rotation. Other times you slide one of those guys to be a spot starter. But at the moment, it seems like the Mets are more inclined to go with the 6-man rotation. So one of those guys ends up in the pen. And when you, again, add it all together, that's 11 pitchers on your staff. You're only going to have 13. So only 2 spots are up for grabs. I know with our Locked On Mets insiders today, I was getting a lot of text messages asking me about the Mets going out and getting another reliever. And I said the same thing to everybody. I don't expect the Mets to, because it's a crowded roster already. Reed Garrett deserves to be on the opening day roster, but he has an option. So there's a chance that Reed Garrett, tough luck, you're in Syracuse again. Daniel Nunez, based on performance last year, deserves to be in the Mets bullpen. He has 2 option years left. Now, I think for Nunez, you can absolutely make the argument that he is best served to start the year in Syracuse because you can manage his workload. He got hurt at the end of last year. They had him on a V-load program this offseason to build him back up. Where is he going to be? How much of a workload can he really shoulder? And maybe it's best to have him on a real innings limit, monitoring him, having him pitch twice a week with multiple days off after each outing for the first couple months of the season if your bullpen is holding up without him, so that you can really have him as a key cog once you get a little bit deeper into the season. I think there's a good chance Nunez does not make this team, not due to merit, but because you were trying to preserve your depth. Now, when it comes to other guys that are in camp on the 40-man roster but have options, Huascar Brazaban, we saw a lot of last year. He has typically had issues getting over for spring training when he was with the Marlins, always had visa issues. So I'll be curious if he actually reported today with the rest of the Mets pitchers. We'll see about that. But he has, again, options to burn. So the Mets likely start him in Syracuse. Same thing with Justin Hagenman, Kevin Herget, 2 guys that picked up this offseason. Austin Warren, another one. Max Kranick, we saw the Mets put him on the wild card roster last year. Never quite pitched, but he is another guy that was a starting pitcher that will be slated for a bulk relief role. He's sort of your Jose Butto insurance in AAA. You got Tyler Zuber, who was acquired at the deadline last year. All those guys are on the 40. All of those guys have options, which means none of them are really expected to make this team. The 2 guys who have the most to prove when it comes to Mets relief pitchers, you have Danny Young and Sean Reed-Foley. Those guys are on the 40-man roster. We saw them a lot last year. No options left. So if you want to see those guys in your bullpen, you can't option them at the start of the season. Like, they have to be there start to finish, or you're going to have to DFA them. So when it comes to those 2 pitchers, there is a chance that they have good camps that they could force Reed Garrett and Daniel Nunez off of the roster simply due to trying to maintain as much depth as possible. Now, Sean Reed-Foley was excellent last year, a 1.66 ERA across 23 appearances, struck out over 10 batters per 9, did get a little bit walk happy at times, but he also did not allow a single home run. He just got hurt a bunch, and that's been his story throughout his Mets tenure. I believe he came over in the John Niece trade. Not John Niece, geez, wrong lefty. Steven Matz trade. Wow. Where Matz went to Toronto. I think Sean Reed-Foley was one of the arms they got back. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure I'm right there. He's been in the organization. If that's the case since, what would that be, 2019? 2019, I think. Regardless, we'll see what happens here with Sean Reed-Foley. My guess is if he's healthy, he makes this team. And I think that's where you probably see Nunez push down. And I would assume that Reed Garrett makes the roster as well, and Danny Young gets DFA'd at some point. But Danny Young, we saw last year, while there was a lot of bad, there was also a couple stretches where he was great. Got a really good slider. He struck at 11.47 batters per nine, had a 4.54 ERA in 42 games. We'll see what happens with Danny Young. One last guy to mention, the only non-roster guy I wanted to talk about outside of the prospects, who we'll briefly touch on in a second, is Genesis Cabrera. Because Genesis Cabrera last year was in the Blue Jays bullpen all season, the MLB bullpen. 3.59 ERA and 62 and 2/3 innings pitched. Left-handed reliever at the Mets, won a second lefty in the pen. Genesis Cabrera will present some real competition to a Danny Young for that second spot if they do want two lefties. And I would imagine that his contract has the ability to be opted out of if he gets another MLB offer at some point. So I think Genesis Cabrera is a guy that has a real shot to make this team, to push somebody off of the roster, but he's got to prove it with a really good spring training. So we'll see what Genesis Cabrera has on deck. I'll talk about all the different non-roster invites on a show later this week. That might be a Friday or a Saturday show, but I want to mention three names when it comes to the non-roster invites. When it comes to prospects, you have Dom Hamill, Blade Tidwell, and Brandon Sproat, who were invited to big league camp. Now, Dom Hamill spent all of last year in Syracuse. Blade Tidwell spent most of last year in Syracuse. Brandon Sproat, the Mets' top pitching prospect, climbed from high A up to triple A, had a lot of success in both high A and double A, really struggled in a small sample size in triple A. He enters this season in a very similar place to where Christian Scott was last year. And this is a great opportunity for him to prove himself, because if he has a really impressive spring, he's going to be in the back of the mind of David Stearns and everyone in that front office, where if anyone in that rotation is stalling early in the season and Sproat is killing it in Syracuse, they might just turn to the kid at some point. You could say the same thing about Dom Hamill and Blade Tidwell. They just have had more prolonged struggles in Syracuse, where some of that top prospect shine has worn off a bit. I still have some optimism on Blade Tidwell in particular, but I also think there's a world where this guy ends up being a high leverage reliever instead of a starting pitcher if he can't figure out a complete arsenal where he can really turn lineups over. Rough year for him. Again, we'll see what he does. Those are three arms that you definitely want to watch early in camp. None of them will make the team, but all of them could have an impact throughout the 2025 season. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. If you enjoyed today's show, tomorrow I'm going to do the same thing, breaking down players with a lot to prove in camp. We're going to be talking about position players, of course. So I'm going to go through all the names between the guys on the 40-man roster, the non-roster invites, the top prospects, all of it. So make sure you check that out. If you are listening on the audio side today, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to be Locked On Mets Insider, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.